Genocide, war crimes, corruption, money laundering, crimes against humanity, and aggression all are crimes that can be traced to Vladimir Putin. Although the Russian president is notorious for the war crimes and slaughter in Ukraine, he has a long history of crimes in his own country through which he has risen to power. In today's video, we are going to unearth all the crimes related to President Vladimir Putin and discuss how he rose to power. We will go through all of the bad things he has done so far in order to stay in power, so make sure to watch the video till the end, and if you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you won't miss any future videos we upload. It is said that Russians don't smile because, well, if you'd grown up on the Russian side of the world, you probably wouldn't smile either. Russian President Vladimir Putin is far eviler in nature towards his own citizens than he is towards the outside world. There have been several stories exposing corruption and alleged ties to organized crime involving Putin during his rise from St. Petersburg mayor to the president of Russia. Because of Putin's rancid incentives, Russia is now ruled by a company made up of ex-KGB operatives and members of the criminal underworld. Due to Putin's rise to power, Putin's ultimate target is not Ukraine, but rather Western civilization, a hatred he embedded along with the KGB's black milk. Putin's struggle for power starts in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Young Vladimir Putin, a KGB officer at the time, was deeply impacted by the collapse and was determined to restore the Soviet Union. Since this time, he has used cruel tactics in his administration's policies in order to restore the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, Putin worked his way up from a lowly KGB position to an advisor for the city of St. Petersburg's mayor, Anatoly Sobchak. After that, Putin became the deputy mayor and head of the Committee on the Foreign Economic Relations. It was the committee's responsibility to encourage, oversee, and provide permits for the development of foreign trade in and via St. Petersburg. The Russian authorities authorized Putin to sign contracts and issue permits in order to expand his economic operations abroad. However, Putin was soon involved in black money and money laundering. During his tenure there, he had transferred billions of dollars to other nations since the early 1990s. These funds came from a wide range of sources, including CPSU and KGB accounts, criminal organizations, and the sale of cheaply produced Russian goods that were resold abroad for a profit. President Yeltsin and Prime Minister Gyadar contracted the services of the American private investigative firm Kroll Associates to track down and return stolen funds. Nearly $15 billion in untaxed income was the target. Kroll discovered hundreds of offshore bank accounts that were opened by unnamed officials and were all connected to Putin. Russian lawmakers responded to Kroll's findings by passing legislation that gives the government the right to recover any money that was improperly transferred abroad. However, the authorities were powerless to confiscate funds that left the country in a legal fashion. In order to legally export goods and transfer funds abroad, St. Petersburg business people were forced to get licenses. Putin, in his capacity as deputy mayor, signed hundreds of contracts and licenses that allowed for the export and transfer of various goods and services. Putin's actions were looked into by the City Council of St. Petersburg, which found that he had signed contracts before he was officially allowed to do so, and that he had agreed to pay large commissions of between 25 and 50% to CFER for each contract and license he signed. In that era, food was extremely scarce in Russia. Contracts were made to ship raw resources to other nations in exchange for food. However, the expected deliveries of supplies either never came or came in an incomplete state. In order to look into the shortages in government contracts, a parliamentary investigation called the Salyer Commission was set up. Putin was asked by the Salyer panel to produce the licenses and agreements for which he was ultimately accountable. Putin ignored the subpoena, and of the hundreds of contracts he had signed, he only gave over 12. Apart from the money laundering and corruption, there is a very long list of people whose deaths are suspected to have been carried out on the instructions of Vladimir Putin. These include liberal politician Boris Nemtsov, investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya, and exiled former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko. Previously, a British government-commissioned inquiry found that Vladimir Putin probably knew that Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in London with polonium because it was done at his direction. But why were they killed on Putin's order? It's because when Vladimir Putin was the Prime Minister of Russia in 1999, both Anna Politkovskaya and Alexander Litvinenko tried to investigate a series of bombings that had taken place. Around 300 individuals were killed in those attacks across 4 Russian cities. There's widespread speculation that Russian security agencies staged the attacks under the direction of Putin to make it look like it was an outside threat. The attacks were, however, attributed to Chechen rebels by the government, which then used this as an excuse to launch a full-scale war against Chechnya. According to a list that was published by the Russian human rights group Memorial in 2016, there were a total of 102 people who were imprisoned in Russian jails as a result of their difference in political beliefs with Putin. Putin's Russia is maintaining the traditions of Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union in this manner by maintaining the practice of sending political dissenters to Siberia or to labor camps, as was done during the time of Stalinism. Among the well-known inmates who have spent time in those labor camps in the past are the industrialist Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the feminist punk group Pussy Riot, the Ukrainian aviator Nadia Savchenko, and the Ukrainian director Oleg Sentsov. Following Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014 and its support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, at least 10 Ukrainian citizens are currently serving long sentences in Russia. Sentsov is one of those individuals. Sentsov was released from detention in 2019 as part of a prisoner exchange, along with a number of Ukrainian nationals. According to him, Russia under Putin has been overly active in conquering other areas and has been destroying and humiliating any resistance they meet along the way. He has met in prison with some of those resistance fighters. He claims this has been going on for quite some time. The insurgents in these regions are put down with extreme brutality and frequently wind up in depraved Russian prisons, where they are treated with the same level of humanity as animals. In order to subdue the political opposition, Vladimir Putin has drawn from an extensive arsenal of tactics. These include laws that restrict the right to free assembly and other civil rights acts, the detention of protesters for ambiguous accusations like hooliganism, the use of notoriously corrupt courts to accuse opponents of embezzlement or tax fraud, direct intimidation by police, and even murder. The majority of Putin's notable opponents have either been banished or coerced into silence as a result of Putin's repressive policies. It was pointed out by Masha Gessen in The New Yorker that Donald Trump's threat to imprison Hillary Clinton during the presidential campaign was reminiscent of how political opponents are most often silenced in Russia by the presidency of Vladimir Putin, not by making them illegal, but by abusing or misusing criminal laws. Before the Ukraine assault, Vladimir Putin, in an effort to enlarge his sphere of influence in the Middle East, provided his report for the repressive regime of Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. At a time when the conflict in Syria was the deadliest conflict of the 21st century, Russia's aid to Assad's forces was extremely helpful and should not be underestimated. According to the United Nations and the governments of the Western countries, the coalition assaulted civilians without taking their identities into account. During the siege and subsequent retaking of Aleppo by Assad and his followers, it was discovered that Syrian forces were slaughtering civilian families according to reports coming from the ground. Russia, the Assad government, and Iran are all responsible for the massacre according to Samantha Power, who was serving as the United States ambassador to the United Nations at the time. Power said of Russia, "Is there actually nothing that can humiliate you?" In the same way, Human Rights Watch undertook an investigation to determine who is responsible for committing war crimes in the province of Idlib, located in Syria. This was the only region of the country that was still held by the armed opposition to the government of the President Bashar al-Assad. There were 46 documented examples of Russian and Syrian military alliance hitting civilian institutions there. It is quite likely that these assaults were planned in advance and carried out in violation of the law, because there are no approved military objectives in the region. This is a very strong sign of illegal activity, and Vladimir Putin is also responsible for these alleged war crimes because he is at the top of the command chain. Since starting his unjustified and illegal war of choice, Russian President Vladimir Putin has unleashed non-stop violence that has left Ukraine in ruins and killed many people. Many residential areas, schools, hospitals, civilian vehicles, shops, and even ambulances have been destroyed by Russian armed forces. Putin's forces used similar tactics when they increased their bombing of the cities in an attempt to suppress the will of local communities in Grozny, Chechnya, and Aleppo, Syria. The world was once again taken back by their attempt to do so in Ukraine, which has resulted in a flood of blood and misery for the Ukrainian people. War crimes committed by Russian troops in Ukraine include torture, rape, and forced displacement. Were certainly known to Russian President Vladimir Putin while he lauded Russian troops for their gallantry on the battlefield. The reports, which largely concern the cities of Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol, are all deeply alarming. The discovery and documentation of a makeshift torture chamber in a disused Bucharest summer camp is one such example. The compartment apparently included equipment for interrogation techniques. 5 guys in civilian clothes were found there, their bodies burned, beaten, and cruelly tortured. The victims had been injured in a variety of ways, including with wounds and bruises. The investigation also found proof that Russian forces kept 25 young women ages 14 to 24 in a cellar in Bucha them at the same time. Last but not least, many people worry that Russian President Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine, the greatest conventional military invasion since World War II, is a precursor to a full-scale global conflict. Over time, Putin amassed more power as he fed on his own absolute authority, imperial aggressiveness, hatred towards Western democracy, and animosity caused by the Soviet Union's demise. Now that Putin has removed his disguise of economic relationship and peaceful collaboration, Europe will now have to deal with the real him. He must be stopped immediately, or World War III could occur. That's all for today's video, guys. What do you guys think of today's video? Tell us in the comment section below. Thank you very much for taking your time to watch this video. See you in the next video, and until then, best wishes.